What's the most difficult decision you've ever had to make? For today's guest, it was a big one.
So it actually, people ask me all the time, was it a hard decision? Was it difficult? But I think for somebody who's always kind of lived looking one direction, and that's forward, it was the pretty obvious decision to make at that point, especially after 3 pretty hard years with it.
How do we make decisions? How do we evaluate whether they were good or bad? Do we even evaluate whether they're good or bad? Are you scared that at some point you're going to look back and say, wow, I regret that decision? Or
No, it's never even for 1 second come into my head one bit.
Let's take an extreme example and apply it to our own lives. I'm Ben Shank, and you're listening to MTNmeister.
Who are the MTNmeisters?
Committing to the goal and galvanizing you and your team behind that one single focus.
Being at peace with that fear and being okay with it.
You gain a real appreciation for your life and for what you have.
Learn about their extreme lives on rock, snow, and ice with your host, Ben Shank.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of MTNmeister. I am Ben Shank. Today with me, I have Ronnie Dickson. Ronnie is a prosthetist by day and a professional boulderer by night. In 2005, at the age of 17, Ronnie lost his leg above the knee because of a congenital disorder called Trevor's disease. After his amputation, he found the sport of climbing and never looked back. Since then, Ronnie has been at the forefront of the disabled climbing movement, competing in competitions around the world and aspiring to be the first above-the-knee amputee to climb the V10 difficulty, which, Ronnie, is about 10 levels harder than anything I can do. Ronnie Dickson, welcome to MTNmeister.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me.
The listeners heard me say there during that little bio that you have what's called Trevor's disease, and I wasn't familiar with it until I started researching a little bit. Just tell our listeners a little bit about what Trevor's disease is, when you encountered it, and then we can go from there.
Okay, perfect. Well, Trevor's disease was a developmental disorder in my growth plates, and for my case specifically, it was in my left knee and my left ankle. So we found out at about the age of 5 that that was something that I had. It didn't really affect too much of my physical activity until I was about 10, when my leg was significantly shorter than my right leg. And so I had to have a series of leg lengthening procedures done to catch my left leg back up to my right.
How is a leg lengthened?
Oh, wow. So yeah, that's the kind of gnarly part to the whole entire thing. They actually break your tibia and fibula, which are the 2 bones in your lower leg, and they insert basically pins into different portions of that bone that are attached to a halo, one at the top end and one at the bottom end. And via that fixture, they're able to lengthen it, about 1 millimeter or so every day until finally they've gotten the desired length that they want to get. So in my case, I needed to lengthen my leg 6 inches.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And then whenever it's all said and done, you just kind of wait for the bone to grow back in the middle. And whenever that grows back, you can take the device off, get a cast on, and once the bone is totally healed, you kind of proceed onwards from there.
Wow. How long does that take?
When I was 10, I was in and out of the hospital for the better part of a year.
Wow.
I missed the majority of 3rd grade while I was in the hospital. But thankfully, believe it or not, something that seems negative like that, I was taken care of over at the Shriners Hospital in Tampa, Florida, and I have nothing but really positive memories from there. Just playing video games, hanging out with friends, those kind of things. Yeah, so what otherwise could have been, maybe a bad time in my life, I still look back on with pretty good memories.
And so, that was 10 years old, and you didn't get your leg amputated until 17. So what were those next 7 years like?
Sure. So the next 7 years were where, we kind of started to see the full effect that the disease would have on me. So things were good, especially after that leg lengthening procedure. I went back to being active, playing basketball, being on swim team, just in general, hanging out with my friends and doing kid stuff. But when I was 14, the sport that I really loved to play was soccer, and it just got to the point where I would be coming home from practice and I would be in a lot of pain, and I wouldn't really be able to walk until the next day when I would wake up in the morning to go to school. So that recovery time was starting to get, more and more progressive. And then, as I inched closer and closer to 17, my knee wouldn't bend anymore. My ankle was kind of fused in a tiptoe position. My leg was short again. So it just started to become obvious, especially given the first leg lengthening procedure, that I could have, a whole bunch of surgeries to try to make something that was never going to be truly fixed okay, or I could just have one surgery to go ahead and just take the whole entire thing off and continue on with my life. So it actually, people ask me all the time, was it a hard decision? Was it difficult? But I think for somebody who's always kind of lived looking one direction, and that's forward, it was the pretty obvious decision to make at that point, especially after 3 pretty hard years with it. So I graduated high school immediately after, had my leg amputated, and my life has been amazing ever since. It's been great.
Normally that sentence goes, I graduated high school, traveled in Europe, and then my life was great after that. Not, I had my leg amputated. Wow, what an interesting time in your life. They say we as men stop really growing at around, 22, 23? Would you have encountered problems at 22, 23 after you stopped growing?
Yeah, with the Trevor's disease, it was just something that was never going to quite work itself out. I'd mentioned those bone tumors that started growing, the one that started to limit the amount of range of motion I had in my knee. And that was just so intertwined with all the blood vessels and all the nerves and everything. That would have been a pretty messy procedure just to go ahead and cut that out. So yeah, it was, and there's no telling, especially like you mentioned, we don't stop growing until we're about 22, 23. It was the growth that was starting to become an issue at this point. At first from lack of it, and then at the end from too much just abnormal bone growth. It's very, very possible that what we would have taken all that time to cut out would have just come right back.
Yeah. You had a choice with this, though, and a lot of people don't have a choice to get their leg amputated. Do you think that you have a different outlook than other people who maybe didn't have a choice?
Definitely. It's just so much of a different scenario. You imagine one scenario, you're riding in your car or you're on a motorcycle, and then, something happens, and you wake up in the hospital 2 days later and your leg's gone. That's a huge shock as compared to here. I've got, quite a bit of time to get comfortable and used to the idea on the front end, and then a perfect kind of intermediate period in my life to get used to it, before I continued, to move forwards. Whereas the other one's just this kind of huge, throws a wrench in any plans that you had pretty immediately.
Humans are really, really scared of regret. I've learned this from a few psychologists, that the fear drives so many decisions that we make. And I think that's why a lot of us have trouble taking risks, because risks are uncomfortable and we're scared that down the road we're going to look back and say, wow, I really wish I wouldn't have done that. Are you scared that at some point you're going to look back and say, wow, I regret that decision? Or has that never come into your head?
No, it's never, it's never even for 1 second come into my head one bit. I think that's what my parents were most worried about, with me being so young, having to make such a big decision. But, honestly, kind of like I said before, I've always just looked one direction, and that's forward. I've never really looked back ever since. I've had a few retrospectives here and there, but yeah, it's always been more of a, wow, that would have been a disaster if I tried to keep that. And by jumping headfirst into the amputation, it's brought so many positive things into my life that I could have never, ever imagined having. Experiences, people, my current employment, what I do as a career. So it really kind of set me on a path of its own Whereas I think I'd just be honestly really unhappy and, definitely not had as much clear direction, had I chosen to keep my leg.
Absolutely. And you've had so much success since then. You're now one of the best rock climbers in the world among amputees with that recent trip to Spain. Just briefly, tell our listeners, you were telling me a little bit before the interview about Spain and the growth that disabled rock climbing has seen in the past few years.
It's been incredible, especially to be a part of it at this stage in the game. Internationally, we're going from a point where, we have a World Championships every 2 years now. So at the 2012 World Championships in Paris, we had 62 athletes, I think, representing 20 plus countries there. And now at this 2014 World Championships that we just recently concluded, we had probably hovering right around 90 athletes representing, close to 40 different countries. So climbing is one of those sports that's, I think, interesting for people with disabilities, just simply because everybody, whether you have all four of your limbs or whether you have three, or whether you're dealing with one thing versus another, you have to learn how your own body climbs and, work around that. So I think it's a really, really great and challenging sport for people to get back into because there's so many different ways a sequence or a route can be done. You're not kind of just kept inside of one box, which is awesome.
For our listeners, we had Craig DiMartino on MTNmeister for episode number 3, way back, a throwback episode. Check that out if you want to hear Craig talk a little bit about how he actually climbs. And we're going to briefly touch on that too here, Ronnie. The thing which I found so impressive when we talked to Craig was that he, with his prosthetic leg, has become almost a visual learner while he rock climbs, and he can see a little ledge on the rock and that's maybe a nickel wide and know that he can put X weight on it, or he sees something a dime wide and knows that the prosthetic will hold Y weight. Have you discovered something similar to that?
Yeah, it's definitely a very visual thing, because essentially you're putting weight through a mechanical device at this point. So absolutely, you spot something, you experiment with different positions, and I say, okay, I know if I put my body weight into this particular hold, one way that it's definitely going to hold me, or I know when I'm going through the sequence, this is my best foothold, but that I should definitely maybe only apply like 30 or 40% pressure to this foot because, anything past that, it might blow. So it's definitely more calculated up front, whereas I think normally through like a climbing sequence, you're feeling it as you're going through the movement. But since there's that lack of feel, you're kind of adjusting for it all on the front end. And then as you're moving through your movement, you've already made those calculations on what you need to do. Yeah,
absolutely. And I guess what I didn't ask earlier is, do you ever climb without the prosthetic leg?
It was a really interesting transition for me. My first year and a half, I would say, because of lack of any specialized equipment and just simply ease in general, I started climbing without my prosthesis. So the very first time I went to the climbing gym, the very first thing I did was take it off because I knew it was going to be problematic the way that I was using it. And just kind of went for that real straightforward approach towards rock climbing. And, okay, where are the hands? And, where's the one foot that I can use to help move myself up the wall? So I climbed like that for about a year and a half. And through that whole entire time, naturally, climbing with one leg, I got really, really strong in my upper body, but I started getting to points in my climbing where I'd be working on some of the same routes as other people who maybe I felt like I was a little bit stronger than, but not able to make it through some of the easier sequences. And that's kind of where I had a light bulb go off in my head where, something's just not adding up here. At the time, I didn't know exactly what that was, but a little bit down the road, through the help of a couple nonprofits, Paradox Sports, Challenge Athletes Foundation, I managed to get some specialized climbing equipment. And it was only, of course, after the fact, with hindsight, that I was like, wow, all of this is really starting to add up and make sense. The different balance point between just climbing with one leg as opposed to two. Even on things where I have a right foot. So I'm like, okay, I have a right foot. I should be able to do this move. Sometimes the amount of core tension that you have to build or hold through your movement is a little bit more intricate than just what seems very simple on the surface. So yeah, definitely in hindsight, I started to discover, some of what I was feeling when I just climbed with one leg. And now, honestly, I'd say for 95% of the climbs that I do, I keep my leg on. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And I find bouldering so impressive. And that's mainly what you focus on, bouldering. First of all, I don't understand how athletes can launch off of the rock and kind of go for a hold. So, for example, if you're standing straight up and down, you wouldn't be able to reach this hold. You have to jump to get it, and you have to jump off of one leg, basically, right?
Yeah.
Unbelievable. There are some videos out there. I'll post a video on your Meister profile page, Ronnie, and our listeners can see it. Very, awesome. Very impressive. Now, by day, Ronnie, you are a prosthetist. I guess, did I say that correctly?
Prosthetist, yeah.
Prosthetist. Okay, you learn something new every day, I guess.
Yeah.
By day, Ronnie, you are a prosthetist. You make legs for people for a living, which is quite fitting. You're the perfect man for the job. We recently had Melissa Stockwell on the show, episode number 76 for our listeners, if you'd like to check out that. We talked about, she's also above the leg amputee, and we talked about the technology in prosthetist. And I was blown away, Ronnie, blown away. I had no idea that there was so much technology, and it's also advancing very rapidly. So tell us what your job is kind of on a daily basis.
Sure. So my job as a prosthetist is essentially, working with patients, fitting and fabricating the prosthetic device and aligning the device for that person. All of our bodies are set up a little bit differently. So making sure that the knee and the foot are working in unison with the prosthetic socket that fits on the individual's leg. Just making sure that they're comfortable, able to go about their daily activities. And then on that other level too, taking it a step further, getting them back into their sports and their recreation, making sure that they're not losing anything in their quality of life. We want to bring that back on an even keel with what it was before.
Absolutely. And it seems, it's a very intricate piece of technology. Are prosthetics expensive?
Yeah, they're pretty expensive. The knee that I'm wearing right now, the prosthetic knee, with what it retails for, it probably cost as much as, I would say, like a Mercedes or a BMW or something like that. Wow,
okay. Is it a problem that these are very expensive? Is there an effort to try to produce less expensive legs?
Yeah, there's a bunch of different ranges where you have equipment available. So, with mechanic and hydraulic legs, let's just speak about the knee joint just to make this conversation a little bit more simple.
Yeah.
You could probably enter in like right around $5,000 to $10,000. Get a pretty good product, but it's not going to be controlled with a microprocessor unit. So going up a scale now, what those microprocessors do is they are actively controlling the hydraulic fluid in the knee, so it's affecting how the knee swings at a consistent rate. Whenever somebody is going to go downstairs, what the microprocessor does is it stiffens up the hydraulic fluid so that person can walk downstairs step over step. Just basically so that the knee joint is fluid during, all the different phases of their gait. And that's kind of the next tier, what I would, go ahead and call for this conversation the mid-tier. Mm-hmm. And now what's happening is we're a step past that. That was the standard for the past 20 years to have a microprocessor-controlled hydraulic unit. But now the knees are coming out with accelerometers, with gyroscopes, so they know where they are in space. They know the velocity at which its user is going, and it's adjusting the hydraulic fluid accordingly so that you're always getting a smooth, consistent amount of heel rise. Whether you're doing the movie theater shuffle in the movie theater line, or if you're running to, catch the next bus or something like that. And, those are the units that, because of all the integrated technology, are, becoming quite expensive. Mm-hmm. And I'd say that's mainly what's been driving the cost up. But there definitely are levels, where you can get into the game a little bit less expensive for sure.
Right. I'm curious, as we talk about this, how do you view your prosthetic leg? Do you see this as a piece of equipment, or is it more intimate than that, I guess?
It's definitely, I'd say my relationship with my prosthetic leg is a little bit more intimate in the sense that I put it on in the morning and I really don't think at all about it until I take it off at night. Like, it's as much a part of me as as my other leg was, and it's definitely, in terms of functionality, a lot more functional than I ever was before, because of some of the other challenges that I was dealing with. So from that sense, yeah, I mean, I wear it, I feel it like it's just mine, and I've gotten comfortable enough with it to where I know exactly what to expect from it. So I'd say that's been my personal experience.
Mm-hmm. And all this, I don't want this to sound obnoxious, but as we talk about this advance in technology, and I'm sure you've been asked this question before or thought about it, at what point are these is a prosthetic leg going to be more advanced than a human leg? I mean, in some respects, it already is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where that line kind of comes up. We've already started kind of dabbling into those realms. We've had bionic technology come out where you have ankles now that are replicating the function of the gastroc muscle and the soleus muscle. So essentially providing that, that powered push whenever you're pressing down with your toe. So think of what you would do, at the end of your gait, or to jump up and down, what your calf muscle does. We have prosthetic ankles that are doing that now. And we have prosthetic knees that are actually powering people upstairs. But, that being said, when it comes to bionic, motorized prosthetic equipment that's actually giving, returning tangible energy, you do run into challenges like big batteries, battery life, the weight of the device. So we're definitely going into that realm where they're actually starting to very, very much so give some of that function back. But it's not yet at a level that's, I would say, feasible for mass use. It hasn't become the standard yet. And I think, until the weight of some of those devices comes down, and then also too, until we get to the point where we're not having to change out batteries every 5 hours, we're probably still maybe, another 5-10 years away between totally jumping into that, that realm.
Well, so as we continue this discussion on equipment and technology, we like to get a gear recommendation from all of our guests. And you can recommend a type of prosthetic leg if you'd like, but I'm not sure how many of our listeners are actually in the market. So anyway, let's hear a gear recommendation.
I guess I'll start it out by saying that I live in Orlando, Florida. So it's not exactly a climber's paradise. But I will say that what we do have close, at a nice little 9-hour drive, is the awesome crags of, right in the region of Chattanooga, Tennessee. One of my favorite crags being Little Rock City, otherwise now known as the Stone Fort. And I'd say probably one of my favorite pieces of gear, because there's so many boulders, so quickly, so condensed, one right near the other. I think in a quarter-mile stretch, you probably have about 600 to 700 just absolutely world-class boulder problems.
Wow.
So I'd say my gear recommendation is the Evolve Ringer crash pad and the Wingman crash pad. And essentially what those are two little drag pads. So they're not full pads at all, but I love going up there, and I've done a lot of these climbs so many different times now to where I feel very comfortable just doing them padless, but I still don't want to I still want to have at least a little bit of protection, and then at the same time too, keep my shoes clean, as I move around the circuit and things like that. So with those two pieces of gear, I can go totally hammer out my warm up without even unpacking my main pad.
Very cool. We will throw both of those on your Meister profile page for our listeners. You can check out that on our website. To close the conversation, Ronnie, I like to ask this question to a lot of our guests because I think it evokes different answers from different people. So you inspire a lot of people out there. I think that's pretty evident. You have a reason to complain and make excuses, but you won't, and that's awesome, and it's a lesson to all of us, really. I'm curious, if you inspire us, who out there inspires you?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a great, always thought-provoking question. It's always kind of one of those things that's developing for me, because my source of inspiration isn't necessarily one that's fixed. There's definitely people who I always associate with inspiration, but it's constantly changing, and it's very dynamic, just kind of based on what's going on in my life at the time. So I could say from my past, I could easily bring up my grandfather. He had a back injury and always dealt with a lot of pain, and I think that's where I get some of my attitude from is him, because I can remember you could tell he was in pain, but he would never ever complain about it or bring that burden onto anybody else, which I always really admired him for. I'd say there's my mom, for kind of instilling in me that never give up attitude, and then lately that changes on a weekly basis is just working with some of our patients here at our clinic that, are getting up and walking for the first time or maybe running for the first time, just kind of feeding off some of that energy, kind of taking my inspiration from the now too at the same time. Awesome.
Yeah. Very rewarding job you must have.
Yeah, it's great. I love it. I honestly, I've had dreams, much like every climber, of living the dream and living out of a van or something like that and going climbing, all across the country. But, I think having that extra stability, that extra little piece in my life, helps keep me balanced in a positive way, and it gives me just something tangible that when I'm not climbing that I can put my energy and focus into.
Ronnie, thanks so much for joining us today on MTNmeister. For our listeners, Ronnie does work with Paradox Sports and the Challenged Athletes Foundation, who, Ronnie, I will be running a marathon for in this coming November.
That's cool. That's awesome.
To find out more, check out Ronnie's Meister profile page on our website, MTNmeister.com. Ronnie, awesome having you today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Hey Meister fans, thanks for listening to that episode with Ronnie Dickson. Hope you enjoyed it. Can't really imagine any reason why you wouldn't have. So I guess you're welcome. You're welcome for presenting you that interview with Ronnie Dickson. I have some exciting news for everybody. To supplement this wonderful podcast, we at MTNmeister have officially launched an email newsletter. Now I know what you're thinking. Oh, great. Another thing to spam my inbox and I'll just press delete right next to it. That's definitely a valid point, but we're doing a few things that will hopefully eliminate that pessimistic attitude of yours. In the MTNmeister newsletter, we're going to start it off with a thought. This is going to be a really quick blurb, 15, 30 seconds to read, but it's going to be thought-provoking. It's going to get your brain working, like hopefully a lot of these episodes do. Then we're going to highlight one or two episodes, just in case you missed them. And then we'll also have the most recent deal, just in case you missed it in one of the episodes. Finally, we'll have a section called Keeping Up with the Meisters, which is similar to Keeping Up with the Kardashians, or maybe not. What we're going to be doing, and this is something that a lot of you have wanted, is to let you know what's going on with the Meisters. Say if Ronnie crushes a competition at the Extremity Games, or if one of our Meisters is doing something else incredible like they do, we'll let you know. You will receive all of this stuff for free, and then some. For those of you who sign up for the newsletter, go to our website, MTNmeister.com, to do it. You will be entered to win a JanSport multi-day pack, perfect for hiking, light mountaineering, even biking, camping trips, well over $100 in value, yours for free. Sign up for our newsletter, MTNmeister.com or MTNmeister.com. Just purchased that guy a couple of days ago. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Until